1. A quaint and quiet damnation. Rustbell did not appear on any campaign map worth the parchment. It sat in a fold of hills at the edge of the Gironite Duchy of Halomir, a scatter of thatch roofs and barley fields ringed by a palisade more suited to keeping out foxes than demons. Its people grew wheat, kept goats, and brewed a cider strong enough to strip varnish. Nothing had happened in Rustbell in 11 years, and the town liked it that way, which was precisely why Sigmar's justice had sent the Iron Howl Vigil to guard it. They called themselves that for the long howling note the war horns of their old chamber used to sound before a charge, a sound none of them had heard in over a year. 6 warriors, bound by thunder and by shame, stationed at the edge of nowhere to keep watch over goats. Their commander was Gamut Sarasi, a knight quester once, broad through the shoulders and gray at the temples despite the eternity Sigmar's lightning had granted him. A gray that came, the others suspected, not from years, but from guilt. He wore his war plate scored and unpolished, a deliberate discourtesy to himself. Some men wear their sins on their sleeves. Gamut wore his in the dents of his pauldrons, and refused to have them hammered out. At his shoulder, always, stood Vitold Heilbronn, his second, a stocky, earnest knight with a laugh too loud for the quiet of Rustbell, and a habit of volunteering for whatever task looked most likely to get a man killed. He had followed Gamut since their first mortal lives, long before the lightning took them, and he followed him still, unquestioning, into whatever came next. It was a loyalty that would, before the year was out, cost him everything a soul can lose. There was Reinhard Lindsay, dour and precise, who sharpened his blade every night whether it needed it or not, because idle hands in Rustbell had a way of turning toward the cider barrels instead. There was Eliot de Loliv, who flirted with the miller's daughter on Sun's Day, the miller's son on Moon's Day, and the tavern keeper's wife on any day she'd allow it, and who somehow remained beloved by all 3 households despite it. There was Orthus Seafarer, an elf of the Idaneth-touched coasts inland now, by some old debt none of the others fully understood, whose ears could catch a whisper 3 fields away, and whose eyes never seemed to blink at the wrong moment. And there was Argog, an orc, broad as a barn door, tusked, green-skinned, and by every rule of the world he ought to have been an enemy. He had come to them broken and starving after a Wa that had chewed through his own kin and spat him out, and Gamut, against every instinct his order had drilled into him, had let him live. Argog had stayed ever since, not out of conquest or hunger, but something closer to gratitude, and he had grown, in his strange way, into the gentlest soul among them. The first to mend a farmer's broken fence, the first to carry a lost lamb back to its pen cradled against his chest, like a father with a newborn. The children of Rustbell adored him. The storm hosts that heard of him thought Gamut mad for keeping him. Gamut did not care. The last of them was not a man at all. Crickhook was a construct of brass and boiler iron, standing 9 feet at the shoulder, steam hissing soft and constant from vents along his spine like the breathing of some patient beast. He had been built by a Dwarden artificer of the Ironweld arsenal, master engineer Borin 9 Thumbs, and loaned to the Vigil as what Borin cheerfully called a live fire trial, which was Dwarden, for I built something I am not entirely certain will not explode, and I would rather it explode near you than near me. Crickhook did not speak often. When he did, his voice ground out of a vox grill like stone dragged over stone. But he thought, and he chose, and something like loyalty burned in whatever passed for his heart. 6 protectors, 1 dying town. It should have been enough. The truth of why they had been sent there was not spoken of, not even among themselves, but everyone in the chamber carried it. A year prior, at the siege of the Verdigris Gate, Gamut had been ordered by a Lord Celestant of a sister chamber to hold formation while 300 fleeing refugees, farmers, children, the old and the lame, were left outside the closing gates to buy the defenders time. Gamut had broken ranks. He had led the Iron Howl Vigil out into the open ground under a black sky of chittering horrors to bring those 300 souls inside, and he had succeeded. But the gate he was meant to be holding fell an hour early for want of his spears, and 40 allied soldiers died in the breach that followed. Sigmar's judges called it insubordination. Gamut called it the only decision he could live with. Both were, in their way, correct. And so the Iron Howl Vigil had been sent to Rustbell, not stripped of their armor, not cast out, but quietly, deliberately forgotten. A punishment dressed as a posting, a place where their courage would never again be asked of them. They did not know, that autumn, that the earth beneath their feet had other plans. 2. What the ground remembers. It was Argog who heard it first, though heard was not quite the word. He and Krikuk walked the north fields that night, the moon thin as a paring knife over the barley stubble. Argog had stopped mid-stride, tusks working thoughtfully, and then simply lain down in the dirt, pressing one long ear flat against the cold earth, the way he did when he wanted to hear the worms turn. Krikuk's boiler ticked in the silence, waiting. "There," Argog said at last, sitting up slow. "You hear?" "No, you feel. Ground's talking." "Define," Krikuk ground out. Argog frowned, the expression strange and gentle on such a brutal face. "Scritch scratch. Deep down. Not badger, not root. Too even. Too much of it." He pressed his ear back to the dirt and held very still for a long minute. "Digging," he said finally. "Lots of digging. Lots of little hands." They walked back to the guard tower together under the thin moon, and neither of them spoke of what kind of little hands dug so patiently, so far from any known warren, in a straight and deliberate line. Gamut met them at the tower door before Argog had finished the sentence, some old soldier's instinct already prickling at the back of his neck. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting, a rare courtesy Argog had learned not to take for granted. And then he looked out over the dark fields for a long moment. "How far off?" "Half mile, maybe less." "Heading—" Argog turned, orienting himself with the unerring sense of a creature raised half underground. "That way. Toward the old windmill. Toward Hallowmere, if it keeps that line." Gamut's jaw tightened. Hallowmere, the duchy seat, 40 leagues east, a city of 80,000 souls that had never once needed the Iron Howl Vigil's protection because it had a garrison of its own 10 times their size. "We wait for light," Gamut said. "I won't send anyone into a hole in the dark on a rumor, even one of yours, Argog. But the moment the sun's up, we dig." 3. The Hollow Road. Dawn found 6 warriors and a handful of borrowed farm shovels standing over a patch of turned earth that Argog swore with absolute conviction was hollow beneath. He was right. Reinhard's shovel broke through with a crack like a snapped femur, and the ground beneath Elliot's boots gave way an instant later, with no warning at all. He dropped 6 feet, cursing florid enough to make even Argog blink, and landed in a passage that should not have existed, a tunnel shored with crude timber and rat-gnawed bone, wide enough for 4 men abreast, running arrow straight in the direction of Hallowmere. Gamut dropped down after him, torch in hand, and felt the old cold certainty settle into his chest that he had not felt since the Verdigris Gate. The tunnel was Skaven work. No one who had fought the Ratmen could mistake it. The acrid reek of warpstone dust, the chewed support beams, the crude glyphs scratched into the walls in patterns that made the eye want to slide away from them. Reinhard paced off the grade and the direction with a soldier's eye, and did the grim arithmetic aloud. This deep, this straight, moving this fast. They've been at it for months already. At this rate, he looked up at Gamut. 2 months, maybe less. Then they're under Hallowmere's walls, and 80,000 people wake up with the ground opening beneath their beds. No one spoke for a moment. Then Vitold, ever the first to volunteer, said what they were all thinking. So we go in. We stop it. We go in, Gamut agreed. Reinhard, you, Vitold, Argog, Krickuk, and I take the barrels down. Elliot, Orthus, you're above. Get the town ready. If we're wrong about the timeline, if there's more than one Warren feeding this dig, I want Rustbelt able to defend itself before we know it. His eyes moved over each of them in turn, and something in his voice hardened into command. Livestock in the pens, doors barred, every man who can hold a pitchfork armed and posted. Nobody sleeps easy tonight. Understood. Understood, Elliot said, and for once there was no smile in it. 4. Into the dark. They took 4 barrels of black powder down into the earth, Krickuk carrying 2 of them slung across his brass back as though they weighed nothing at all, and followed the tunnel east by torchlight for the better part of an hour. The air grew close and foul, thick with the ammonia stink of ratkin nesting, and the walls sprouted side passages like veins branching from an artery. 3, then 5, then more than Gamut cared to count, spreading out beneath the fields, in a warren clearly meant to move an army, not a handful of raiders. Here, Reinhard said finally, where 4 tunnels met in a crude junction shored with stolen timber. If we drop this, we collapse the whole junction. Nothing gets through this way again. Not this year. They worked fast and quiet, packing the barrels against the support beams, running fuse cord in careful loops, the ordinary grim competence of soldiers who had done far worse in far worse places. Vitold hummed while he worked, an old marching tune from some campaign none of the others could place, and Gamut found himself almost smiling at it, despite everything. Then Orthus went still. He had been standing sentinel a little apart, elf eyes fixed on the dark mouth of the eastward tunnel, head tilted at an angle no human neck could quite manage. Slowly he turned back to the others, and whatever was on his face killed the humming in Vitold's throat. They're coming, Orthus said. A great many of them. And soon. 5. The Hollow War. The first wave came out of the dark like a burst dam, a screaming, chittering flood of clan rats in rusted mail, blades notched and black with old use, weapon teams dragging warp fire throwers on creaking wheels behind them. Gamut had one heartbeat to shout, "Form!" before the tunnel junction became a slaughter yard. Reinhard took the left passage with his blade a blur, cutting a rat man nearly in half at the waist with a single stroke, its innards steaming in the cold tunnel air before he'd even finished his turn to meet the next. Krikuk planted himself in the widest passage like a brass door slammed shut, his steam-driven fists coming down with the sound of a smith's hammer on an anvil, each blow crushing skulls and driving whole clusters of ratkin back into the ones behind them, a wall of dead and dying flesh piling at his feet. Argog laughed, an honest, delighted laugh utterly incongruous with the carnage, and waded into the thickest press of them bare-handed at first, then armed with whatever blade he tore from a dead ratman's grip, tossing bodies aside like a farmer clearing brush. For all his gentleness above ground, something ancient and terrible woke in him below it, and the Skaven that came within reach of his arms did not live to regret coming closer. Vitold and Gamut held the center, back to back, and here the fighting was worst of all. A weapon team's warp fire thrower belched green flame down the passage, and Vitold threw himself in front of it, his shield catching the worst of the blast, the Sigmarite scorched black and steaming as he roared through the pain and put his sword through the gunner's throat. Blood, his own, mixed with theirs, ran black in the torchlight. They gave ground by inches, not by choice, but by arithmetic. For every ratman that fell, 3 more scrambled over the corpse to take its place, and the passage behind the Stormcasts filled with the dead in drifts that reached the knee, then the thigh, slick footing made slicker by gore. Reinhard's blade arm burned. Argog's borrowed sword snapped at the hilt, and he simply picked up a fallen ratman's own cleaver and kept going. Krikuk's boiler screamed with the effort of the fight, steam venting in furious jets, brass plating scored and dented by 100 glancing blows. And then, at the back of the swarm, illuminated by the guttering green witchlight of the warp fire throwers, Gamut saw him. Tall for a Skaven, draped in looted armor and warpstone talismans that clicked and chimed with every twitching movement, a jagged blade in one paw and a whip-thin tail lashing behind him like a hunting cat's. He did not fight. He watched, red eyes bright with satisfaction, as his horde ground the intruders down. "Gamut thing?" the creature shrieked, delighted over the din. "Snun Heisbark know you. Snun smell you dying. Yes, yes. Push, my children. Push them back into the dark where they came from." Gamut's blood went cold, and then hot. A warlord who knew his name, in a tunnel that should have been secret, meant a hunt planned long before tonight. But there was no time to wonder at it. The horde surged again, and the Iron Howl Vigil gave ground once more, step by bloody step, back toward the junction and the barrels and the fuse cord still coiled where they'd left it. Then, abruptly, the Skaven fell back. It should have felt like relief. It felt like a trap closing. Gamut understood a heartbeat later. Heisbark wanted them out, wanted them running for the surface, wanted the tunnel intact for whatever came next, which meant the tunnel dying tonight mattered more than ever. "Go!" Gamut bellowed, and the 5 of them broke for the junction at a dead sprint, Ratkin snapping at their heels, but no longer pressing the true attack. Gamut was last through, torch still burning in his fist, and as Reinhard hauled Vitold, bleeding, staggering, alive, up through the collapsed entry hole, Gamut turned back one final time and flung the torch down onto the fuse cord trailing into the dark. The earth screamed. A great cough of dust and fire roared up out of the collapsing junction, and the ground bucked beneath Gamut's boots as he threw himself up and out of the hole a bare second before it folded in on itself entirely, burying the eastward tunnel under 100 tons of Gironite topsoil. Somewhere below, an army that had been advancing on Hallowmere for months was, for now, buried in stone and silence. Gamut lay in the barley stubble a moment, chest heaving, and allowed himself exactly 3 seconds of relief. "They'll dig another way," Reinhardt said grimly, helping him up. "I know," Gamut said. "I know." That was when the scream reached them from the town. 6. The second wave. They turned as one, and in the pale mid-morning light saw it, a churning black tide surging up out of a dozen fresh holes torn in the earth between the fields and Rustbell's palisade, closer to the town than the tunnel they had just collapsed. Snun Heisbark had not committed his whole strength to the ambush below. He had held back a second horde, ready to strike the town itself the moment the vigil was spent from the fight underground. "Form on me," Gamut roared, and Elliot and Orthus came pelting from the palisade gate to meet them, townsfolk with pitchforks and hunting bows falling in behind at a wary distance, livestock already screaming in barred pens. The 6 of them, bleeding, exhausted, powder burned, formed a line between the horde and the town gate, and the second battle of that terrible day began. It was worse than the first. There was no tunnel to funnel the enemy, no choke point to hold, only open ground, and a horde that outnumbered them by the score, weapon teams wheeling their warp fire throwers into range, a ragged unit of armored storm vermin at their fore, with blades like black icicles. Vitold took the charge of the storm vermin alone. Later, none of them could say exactly why, whether he saw a break forming in the line and moved to plug it, or whether some part of him had simply decided, in the grinding fatigue of that endless morning, that this was the moment his life had been building toward. He planted himself in the gap and became an island, sword singing, shield a wall of dented Sigmarite, and for a handful of glorious heartbeats, he held them. Then the numbers told, as numbers always do. A storm vermin's blade opened his sword arm to the bone. A second drove a spear through the weakened plate at his side. He fought on, one-armed, roaring Gamut's name and the old battle cry of their chamber, and the horde simply closed over him the way water closes over a stone. 3 ratmen, then 6, then a dozen, blades rising and falling, a warp fire thrower's green flame washing over the whole writhing mass. Gamut fought toward him, screaming, cutting down everything in his path, but the tide was too thick and too fast, and by the time he reached the place where Vitold had stood, there was nothing left standing at all, only a great pyre of the slain, and at its heart still, impossibly, breathing. Vitold looked up at him. Blood filled his mouth. He tried to smile. "Told you," he rasped. "I'd hold the line. This time." Then the light took him. It came the way it always came, a bolt of celestial lightning tearing down out of a sky gone briefly and terribly white, wrapping what remained of Vitold Heilbronn in cold blue fire and hauling him upward, soul and spirit torn free of failing flesh, back toward distant Azir, to be broken down to nothing and rebuilt anew in Sigmar's forges. It was not death, the priests always said. It was only departure. But Gamut watching his oldest friend's body dissolve into thunder and ash on a field of Gironite mud, knew better than any priest what the price of it truly was. That some sliver of the man who had followed him for 2 lifetimes would not survive the reforging. That whoever walked out of the Sigmarite forges wearing Vitol's face would remember a little less of this day, of this world, of himself, than the man who had died in it. A resurrection? Yes, but never quite a return. Grief has no time in a battle. Gamut turned that grief instead into something with an edge, and threw himself back into the fray with a fury that made even Argog fall back a step. 7. The Warlord's Reckoning. He found Snunhighsbark at the heart of the horde, exactly where a coward general always stands. Close enough to claim the victory, far enough to flee the loss. Gamut thing comes to die after all, Highsbark shrieked, delighted, warp stone blade raised. Snun will wear your bones. Yes, yes, a trophy for the council. Gamut did not answer him with words. They came together in a clash that cleared a ring of space around them, Ratkin scattering from the sheer violence of it. Highsbark was fast, faster than his bulk suggested, his jagged blade licking in from angles no human fencer would consider. Warpstone talismans crackling with sickly energy that turned aside blows that should have killed him twice over. He opened a gash along Gamut's ribs, another across his jaw, laughing all the while, certain of the outcome. But Gamut Saras had broken a gate to save 300 lives and paid a year of exile for it. Had just watched his oldest brother torn to lightning in the mud. And he did not know how to lose to anything. Not anymore. He took Highsbark's next blow on his shield, stepped inside the reach of that wicked blade, and seized the warlord by the throat with one gauntleted fist. Highsbark's laughter died into a strangled shriek. Gamut looked into those bright, cruel, suddenly terrified eyes for one long moment. Then he broke his neck. The snap of it carried over the whole battlefield, and something in the horde's cohesion broke with it. The deep, animal cowardice at the heart of every Skaven army surfacing all at once as their warlord's body went limp in a Stormcast's grip. The tide that had been pressing forward became, in the space of a breath, a tide in full and screaming retreat, Ratkin trampling their own wounded in their haste to reach the safety of their tunnels. After them, Gamut roared, and the Vigil surged forward as one, Reinhard and Elliot flanking wide to cut off the fleeing warband before it reached the collapsed tunnels, Orthus's blade, a silver blur among the stragglers. Argog, simply running down anything too slow to escape him. Krikuk's steam hammer fists finishing what the rest could not catch. It was not a battle any longer. It was a reckoning. By the time the sun stood high over Rustbell, the fields were littered with the dead in their hundreds, and of Snunhighsbark's second horde, perhaps a dozen ratmen remained alive to vanish, shrieking, back into whatever holes had not yet been sealed. 8. What remains? The town gathered in the square as the Iron Howl Vigil returned through the palisade gate, blood-soaked, powder-burned. 5 where there had been 6 that morning. No one cheered. It did not feel like the kind of victory men cheer for. Gamut stood before them anyway, and made himself speak, though every word cost him something. "You held your homes today," he said, voice carrying rough and clear across the square. "Every one of you, every pitchfork, every barred door, every child kept quiet and safe indoors, while the world tried to come apart outside it. That is not a small thing.
That is the thing an entire city 40 leagues from here will owe you, and never know to thank you for. Rustbell is not the quiet, forgotten corner of the realm. You believe it to be. It is the wall that kept Hallowmere standing. And you were that wall. Every one of you. Today.
A ragged, uncertain cheer rose from the crowd, grief and relief tangled together, the way it always is after a battle no one asked for. Gamut did not join it. He turned instead to what remained of his chamber, Reinhard cleaning his blade with mechanical, grief-numbed precision. Elliot sitting on an overturned cart with his head in his hands. Ortha standing silent, sentinel over the place where Vitold had fallen, as if his watching now could undo what his hearing had failed to prevent. Argog kneeling in the mud with one great green hand pressed flat over his own chest, mourning in whatever way an Auric mourns. Crickhook's boiler ticking low and slow, steam drifting from his vents like a held breath, finally released. Gamut looked at them for a long moment, and something in his weathered face was not triumph at all, but a cold, banked fury. At the council of the Under Empire, at Sigmar's judges who had sent them here to be forgotten, at himself. For every choice that had led 5 friends to stand in a muddy square short one brother. We buried one tunnel today, he said quietly, only for them. We did not bury the ones digging it. Heisbark is dead, but the Under Empire does not mourn its warlords. It simply sends the next one, hungrier than the last. He looked east, toward the collapsed fields, toward the dark still waiting patiently beneath them. This isn't over, Gamut Saras said, not by a long road, so rest tonight. All of you have earned that much. But at first light, we start digging again, because whatever comes up out of that ground next time, I intend to be ready for it. Behind him the sun began to set over Rustbell's quiet fields, painting the barley gold and red. And beneath the earth, in the dark, something patient continued, unseen, to dig.